We've got to have more of this neighborhood expression of care. And this is what I give. I give an expression of care every day to each child to help him realize that he is unique.
You've almost definitely heard that voice before. That's Mr. Rogers speaking before a Senate subcommittee in 1969, defending the value of funding for public media. The chairman of the committee said his words were so moving they gave him goosebumps, and the funding was saved. In the Hollywood version of this story, that's the last time we ever had to have this debate. But unfortunately, life is not so simple. Conservatives have continued to wage battle against publicly funding media, especially news channels like PBS and NPR. As I discuss with my guest today, NPR CEO Katherine Maher, the reality of what that funding goes to is a lot more complicated. But so is the discussion about what's behind the controversy. NPR in particular has come under intense scrutiny for having too much of a liberal bias. Maher disputes that, although she says the network is working to increase the diversity of perspectives listeners hear. But even that is not such a simple task. Katherine, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Tell me, we're talking right now, it's midday Wednesday. What's the status right now of federal funding for NPR and other public media? Are you facing an imminent threat of losing it, or is it more of a this could happen and we're concerned about it?
Like all things with Congress and just general federal matters, it is more complicated than a single sentence. But I would say the threat is very real. And the concerns are that it would impact significantly the network of public media stations, having the most immediate impact actually on our colleagues over at PBS and their children's education programming already has been reported.
Yeah.
And then the secondary impacts, which we think will take a little bit longer to play out, will largely be borne by smaller stations.
Yeah.
And of course, NPR and PBS as well. So there's a whole host of issues, from the executive order to congressional appropriations to a rescission memo. Where do you want to start?
Yeah, well, I mean, I actually do want to talk about the local stations because I think they're really important. But just to get the lay of the land now, because obviously this has been in the air for a while, but something feels different about the aftermath of this executive order. And one of the things I understood is normally the budget is a couple years out, but you mentioned rescission. There is this notion and there's this possibility now with DOJ that they could claw back money that's already been allocated.
That's right. So the budget for public media is set 2 years in advance. It's one of the very, very few advance appropriations, and maybe the only one that is a 2-year advance. And the whole purpose of that was in order to be able to insulate public media from political climates of the moment, recognizing that as media as a whole, there are going to be times when media and politics are not always in alignment, and nor should they be. That's part of the promise of independent media organizations. The funding for fiscal year 26 and 27 has been appropriated by Congress. The most recent act, or the sort of statement by the White House, has been to propose a rescission, which is to claw back those funds from Treasury so that those are not available to the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to distribute. That is sort of the direction of the White House to Congress. You then also have the next consideration, which is the current year's appropriation, which would be for fiscal year 28, that is under discussion as part of the overall budget that Congress is looking to pass or reconcile at this moment in time. And then you have the executive order, which directs the end of federal funding dollars to NPR or PBS specifically as public media organizations.
Yeah. And although this has come up before, there's something in the air now that makes it feel a little more worrisome.
Well, I think we've seen conversations around federal funding before, and they have been serious in the past. In the 80s, there was the sort of famous testimony of Mr. Rogers in Fred Rogers in terms of the value of public media for children's education in particular.
Thought it was the final word at the time, or seemed like it.
And in general, I think that while this has been a topic from a policy perspective, I think this is the first time that people view this as not just a conversation about a congressional funding or not funding, but specifically targeting two organizations out of the entire public media ecosystem. So, public media is not just NPR and PBS. Public media is also American Public Television. It is also American Public Media, which produces a number of different shows and distributes shows. It's PRX. There are so many aspects to public media that are not always immediately visible or legible to a public media consumer. And this is very specifically about the two largest and most recognized organizations, NPR and PBS. And I think that that is also what makes it different, is that singling out.
Help me understand how the funding actually works, though, right? Because correct me if I'm wrong, but it's a pretty small percentage of NPR's budget that comes directly from federal funding, right?
That's right. It's so overall, public media receives on an annual basis 535 million for general operations, and then an additional 60 million for infrastructure, public safety, all of the things that we do that are part of running a national broadcast network that are more about the sort of advancement of common interest beyond programming, journalism, and the like. So total is about 595 million. And of that, 75% goes to television and 25% goes to radio. Even within that 25%, so 121.5 million, just about, I think,
Hmm.
the vast majority of that goes directly to stations. And so we're
Yeah.
talking 100 plus million of that 120 million, give or take, going out to stations that use that funding for everything from maintaining their radio towers in challenging topographies to upkeep of their infrastructure, studio equipment, space, to hiring local journalists. And then a portion of it goes to acquiring programming, some of which comes to NPR and some of which goes to other producers, not just public media producers like PRX or APM, but also increasingly to a more competitive landscape that looks at productions like the New York Times is the Daily or Today Explained
Mm.
from Vox Media. So those funds are used at the discretion of stations based on what they think is going to be most compelling for their audiences to listen to. And then NPR gets a smaller percentage of this. We receive about 1% of our budget in total for content programming, and that goes to things like increasing the capacity to cover the US election on a 4-year basis. It goes to increasing our capacity to cover conflicts when those erupt around the world, whether in Ukraine or Israel and Gaza more recently. But generally speaking, they're sort of one-offs. They don't tend to fund longer term editorial considerations.
So NPR and PBS are in the like political eye of the storm here, but you aren't the networks that are actually the most at risk if this funding goes away.
If the funding goes away, what is most at risk is local stations.
Yeah.
The percentage of funding varies for your local station's operating budget. For larger stations, it may be less. It might be something like 6% or 8% at the very largest stations. But then it's a pretty quick journey down to 15% or even up to 40 or 50% for some of the really rural or tribal stations that public media serves. And that is significant for their operations. It does impact the ability to maintain a newsroom, as certainly as we see with news deserts expanding across the country. Public media is often one of the only resources for local news gathering. I think it's about 20% of Americans live without a local news source in their community, and public media
Mm.
often steps in to fill that breach. It also means degradation of quality of service. So I mentioned sort of broadcast towers. We are one of the very few entities that has universal coverage for the country, because very often you'll go out into rural areas or areas with topography that interferes with broadcast
Yeah.
signals,
Yeah.
and it's hard to be able to get that over the airwaves, let alone over broadband. Many places in the country have very poor last mile infrastructure or don't have cell phone service. And so our investment in those towers allows us to cover 99.7% of the country, and that's at risk as well. So we could really see not just news deserts, but sort of communication deserts as well.
You hinted at this, but I mean, we know that these stations also play a major role in emergency management. They are sometimes the only form of communication in a time of natural disaster, so that it's more than just news.
That's right. So, three stations in particular come to mind on the natural disaster side. Raven, Alaska, Blue Ridge Public in Asheville, and Maui in Hawaii, all in recent years have contended with either wildfires in the case of Maui, the Hurricane Helene in the case of Asheville, and then just a 2 week outage of connectivity in Alaska. And public radio was a tremendous resource in that time for all the reasons you'd expect from a local station. It meant that there were reporters on the ground. It meant that people were familiar with the community. In Blue Ridge Public, our reporters were often sleeping in the studio.
Hmm.
Residents of the surrounding area would tune in to catch what was going on in terms of not just the reporting of people on the streets, but clean water, access to food, reports from press conferences of municipal officials, not just Asheville, but the surrounding towns as well. State of emergency alerts. That has been described to me by multiple residents of Asheville as actually life saving at that time. And certainly beyond life saving, a source of tremendous community connection that was apparently quite important psychologically as well, to
Yeah.
feel as though people were in something together and to have a resource to turn to.
So can you give me a little peek at what you guys are doing to fight back now, if that's even the right term? I mean, obviously there's a public campaign, you're doing interviews like this. Is there a legal battle that's potentially being mounted?
We are looking at what those legal options are and feel as though there are some strong bases for us to be able to contest the executive order, including some principles under the First Amendment that we feel make the order, unconstitutional or a violation of statute. The Public Broadcasting Act is pretty explicit that it is meant to protect against interference from executive or elected official action, members of the government in general, when it comes to content and to ensure
Mhm.
that editorial integrity. So I don't know that I can say much more than that at this point, but that's certainly something that we're in active conversation around. As far as the rest of it, we are working with our stations. They have such extraordinary presence, 246 across the country in all 50 states, and serve so many different communities. It's important for Congress and to be hearing from them about the value that they offer to the constituents of members of Congress. And I think that is something that is recognized even among members of Congress who serve predominantly conservative districts. There is an appreciation for what public media offers and a recognition that at the local level in particular, what the public media stations focus on is often quite relevant to local
Yeah.
communities. So I'm thinking about, for example, Harvest Public Media, which serves some of the more agrarian parts of the center of the country, which was reporting recently on the National Weather Service balloons and what the implications of budget cuts might be for the ability of farmers to get accurate weather reports for managing crops. And so that doesn't go out on NPR's main broadcast, but that is a collaboration and a partnership that we have. It's how we serve a very specific audience as opposed to necessarily the morning edition audience. And we do that by working together with all of our local stations. So those reminders of that importance and that value and that local knowledge is something that we're working to remind Congress of in this moment.
It's interesting though because you're kind of having to fight this battle on two fronts, right? You're having to make the case for the value of the pure news delivery of these local networks, but you're also engaged. I mean, it's pretty much been your entire tenure as CEO engaged in this more political battle about what is NPR and is it too liberal? Is it indoctrinated in some way? Do you feel like you are making inroads in that fight? I mean, do you feel like there's some legitimacy to this idea that NPR has a tilt?
Well, I'll start by saying I personally think that we have an obligation to be really even and thoughtful in our coverage about how we reflect the nation. And what I mean by that is ensuring that we are not just reporting on issues that seem interesting in DC because it's part of the national political conversation. And so the example of the weather balloons might be a good one. There's plenty of other examples about that type of local engagement and coverage. I think that That is also a bit of a rejoinder to this idea that there is a political bias to our work. I sort of differentiate between criticisms of partisan bias. I think that, in fact, NPR's reporters on our Washington desk and around the country on state house duties and covering campaigns are actually right right down the line. They play it straight, whether it is reporting from the field or whether it is offering invitations to guests to come on. We can't control who takes us up on those offers, but we certainly make them aggressively to members of all political parties and the current administration, the past administration, and the like. So on the pure reporting side, I feel really confident that NPR is in a good place. I think that the thing that sometimes comes up is more of a confluence of either issue-based questions of, are we addressing issues that feel like they're part of the cultural zeitgeist. So we
Mm.
talk a lot about the need to report on the diversity of the nation. Well, the diversity of the nation encompasses a whole host of people. Yes, conservatives, absolutely. Religious people. It also encompasses LGBTQ people. It encompasses members of minority communities. And if we are meant to report to the public on the public, we have to tell those stories. So when I hear criticism, for example, that we, featured a gay couple and a story about children's education, I understand how that might be frustrating from a perspective of somebody who feels as though that is overly woke. But I also think as though that is actually just a reflection of the nation as a whole, and it's part of our mission and our statute to serve the whole nation, but also the unserved and the underserved. So that's a sort of tricky one, but
Hmm.
hopefully this is a space for nuance in the conversation.
Sure. So, I mean, essentially, I think you're defending the need to cover these kinds of things. You're not saying we're going to stop covering something just because you call it woke and wish we didn't ever talk about it.
I mean, I think that we need to be really thoughtful about how we cover issues. An example that I've used internally is, not to pick on anyone. I don't even remember who the reporter was, but I heard the term privileged be used, and I thought,
Mm.
okay, that's a word that means something. It's also a word that is can be a signifier, and I'm not even sure what it meant in the context of the sentence. I didn't know if it meant that the subject of the report had more access, more stability, more economic advantage. I think it's important that when we're reporting, we're entering into it with curiosity and also being really direct in the communications that we're using, as opposed to perhaps relying on terms that might be signifying to one community or another about some sort of political tendency.
I've also heard you talk about viewpoint diversity, which, I thought it was interesting because I think there was the Uri Berliner essay that went quite viral and had a lot of provocative claims, some of which I think have not held up to scrutiny over time. But one of the things he did mention was a lack of viewpoint diversity on NPR. I mean, do you think that it's a legitimate issue? And is it how do you go about addressing that? What's sort of your thought process?
Well, one of the things that we've done that again, I'm not in the newsroom, so this
Right.
is all credit to the newsroom here, that I really appreciate is going into this administration, our editorial leadership were very explicit that we want to be hearing directly from policymakers and newsmakers, not simply bringing people on to talk about those policies. So perhaps there's a little bit of a stereotype of NPR as having sort of an academic perspective. Call someone from a major university to talk about immigration policy or economic policy. Sometimes that can be useful. Say if that person used to hold a position in another administration, or they were some sort of senior advisor or part of producing policy. But oftentimes, it's much more constructive and helpful for the audience to just hear directly from people. I think that an example of that is Steve Inskeep interviewed Steve Bannon recently, and it was sort of a
Mm.
longer interview for us. I think it was almost 12 minutes in length.
Hmm.
That is a great example of putting somebody in front of the public who can make the case for their beliefs, make the case for their political affiliation and policies that they want to see. Steve Inskeep asked a set of really good questions. I think it's important for us to do that as an organization if we're really seeking to give people access to understanding about the lives that they live and the society that we live in.
I've heard you also mention that you'd like to see more conservatives come on the show and conservative lawmakers, I wonder if there's a little bit of a self-fulfilling thing here where they portray NPR as a network that's so liberal and so biased that they'll never give them a fair shake, and then they, of course, won't go on it, and so then you end up not having those voices.
I have certainly heard different things when I speak to members of Congress and their staff about this. I know that there are a number of members who actually really appreciate, including conservative members, going on their local stations because it's an opportunity to
Mm,
speak directly to constituents. And so that might be the local morning show, it might be the local public affairs show. And I've certainly heard whether we're talking, Great Plains, whether we're talking Southwest, really kind of wherever, that folks feel as though that they get a fair shake on there. I would reinforce this idea that when you have the opportunity to come on NPR, we have a fairly large audience. In fact, my understanding is that our morning show, Morning Edition, is one of the most popular morning shows, television and radio combined, in the country. And so it's an enormous audience that you have an opportunity to reach. And by declining to come on NPR, you are missing the opportunity to speak to people who might otherwise not be watching, an alternative program. So I think there is at times something of a self-fulfilling prophecy. And I think it's imperative of us to continuously reinforce the idea that we're really here, we're nonpartisan, we're meant to serve the American public, and that means hearing from more people.
I guess the risk is how do you avoid going too far the other way, right? I mean, I've already seen, and I asked this question with so much sympathy for the difficulty of your situation, but I've seen on social media people being so upset that, like, for instance, a recent NPR piece about investigations from the Trump administration into medical journals, that in addition to quoting a number of people saying how outrageous it is, it then has a quote from someone asserting that medical journals are, in fact, very biased and deserve to be investigated in this way. And people said, oh, look, they're doing the he said, she said thing. But it is a legitimate challenge, right? How do you include viewpoint diversity without falling into this trap?
I think that the best way to do that is to speak to people who are affected by the news at hand. Because
Mm,
when you're speaking directly to members of the public, whether it sounds, if it's medical journals, whether that is a medical doctor who is in a teaching hospital, or, I'm just kind of sort of coming up with these examples,
sure, sure, sure.
you can hear directly from people who are pro an issue or have concerns about an issue from a position of expertise as opposed to a position of political belief. Maybe there's political belief to interrogate there, but I think the more that we focus on, well, what does this mean for the public? What does this particular policy mean? How do people interpret it? Why do they support it? Why do they not? That is less a he said, she said, and more a reflection of, the genuine complexity of the country. And I think health is actually such an interesting example because it doesn't necessarily neatly break down into sort of partisan lines. And I always reinforce this is that none of us are just a particular political platform or party. Everyone sort of holds a range of contradictions. And so it's important for us to be able to speak to a whole host of different issues with different perspectives.
Would NPR be better off if it didn't get any federal funds? If you just didn't have to have this conversation at all with a bunch of politicians who are up for election every 2 years?
This question comes up all the time, you know?
I'm sure.
Um, and I'm not saying internally, I just mean it's always a question I'm asked.
I'm sure. I'm sure.
And what I would say is the following. One is that I don't believe you can have a national network that's sustained without that support. And so when we
Mhm.
talk about having 200 newsrooms across the nation, that is an extraordinary thing, right? 200 newsrooms, 3,000 journalists, in addition to NPR's own newsroom and journalists. What so few media organizations have that capacity, and even fewer are made up of people who are really rooted in the communities that they are serving, whether they're from there or they've been covering the community for a really long time. They know the peculiarities, they know the way to pronounce the streets in town. I think that really matters. And there's a degree of sensitivity that comes out of that reporting when you have that familiarity and are not just parachuting in. That would go away if we lost federal funding because you wouldn't necessarily be able to sustain all of those newsrooms. And that to me is such an enormous value, not just for NPR, but really for the nation as a whole. We know that there's a correlation between presence of local news and greater civic engagement. We know that there's a correlation between local news presence and lower rates of polarization, greater sort of capacity to communicate across difference. So I think that really matters as part of the civic infrastructure of our democracy. And then you have the question of, would it be better for NPR? And I think we would all be lesser if we didn't have the ability to call a journalist in a town where something is happening, the local bureau, and say, "Hey, are you on this? Can you give us, can you give us the color? Can you report from the scene?" Because then
Mm,
we're also hearing it in the voice of people who have proximity and awareness of what matters, not just in their community, but can then communicate it out to the nation for greater understanding. So
yeah.
having that federal funding keeps us both tied to places we wouldn't necessarily be able to support if it was just a pure market driven media organization, which I think is why you see these news deserts emerging. And it also ties us to a mission and a commitment to serving an audience that is the entirety of America. Even if we're not where we would want to be today, it's a goal that we need to continue to drive towards. And I think we need to take very seriously.
And ironically, if you go back to the original funding, I understand the idea behind the model was by having it be federally funded in the way that it is, it would be insulated from political interference and politics, as opposed to being subject to the whims of whatever someone in power wants them, or frankly the kind of authoritarian rule of subscribers, which I think a lot of media organizations deal with too.
Yeah, I feel like that's often a thing that gets missed, right? Is that not just subscribers, but really what we're talking about with many media organizations that are successful these days are very niche audiences. So there's been much made of the sort of decline of broadcast media or mass media as a whole. And in fairness, that the numbers bear that out. But what
Hmm.
you've seen replace it are really functionally niche media. It's the sort of Substack, it's the social media influencer. It's not that those aren't successful and economically viable, but it doesn't speak to as large an audience. And it tends to hyper target a specific subset of needs. That means that we're all having conversations in parallel about the so-called national discourse as opposed to turning to a common sort of trusted resource. And it's interesting. I speak a lot with other public broadcasters from around the world, and one of the things that was observed to me is perhaps part of the reason, Britain emerged from the post-pandemic period with greater social cohesion than some other nations is really a function of the fact that despite criticism of the BBC, there's still a tremendous amount of social trust in that
Yeah.
institution, and people ultimately were consuming conversation, news, dialogue, debate from the same source, and so it really set the common table for further conversation.
Well, and so I guess to get back to this idea of fighting this battle on two fronts, I mean, you might survive the latest funding onslaught. You might.
I hope.
Yeah, I mean, like we can hope, and but at the same time, you're talking about a bigger fight, really, for NPR to remain or maybe even reestablish itself as a sort of the center of the dinner table for discourse in America.
Well, I also always feel like it's important to note that even though there is a perception in the political conversation right now that we somehow, that we lean one way, the reality is that our traffic to our podcasts and to our website, where we have much more granular data than on the broadcast, actually really represents the diversity of political views in the nation. It's about a third conservative, a third independent, and a third liberal. And so when we talk about this idea that we need to reclaim that, I think that some of that is true as we see sort of a accelerated polarization in the country. We need to acknowledge that. But I also think that we need to celebrate what we've done already, which is we've built an audience around things that are newsworthy and valuable that people of all different backgrounds come to because they have confidence in the quality of the reporting. And I just never want to lose sight of that, even at the same time that I am in agreement with you that we have a bigger sort of charge to take on as one of the nation's public broadcasters.
I want to let you go, but I have to say, I mean, listening to you say those data points, like it feels wrong to me And maybe it's my misapprehension, but it feels like I see the NPR tote in Brooklyn and I don't see it to the same amount in Central Ohio. I mean, that's anecdotal, obviously, and maybe I'm way off, but I'm surprised to hear those numbers.
Yeah, I I was just out in Central Ohio recently. I
Okay.
confess I also didn't see a tote, but then again, people in Brooklyn are trying to schlep their stuff on the subways, and folks in Central Ohio tend to
True.
be, in their cars. But
Fair.
so who knows what they're listening to? But what I'll say is that is what our numbers tell us. I mean, and
Mm.
it's interesting, even on election night when we were looking, that tends to be one of the peak sort of traffic moments for our network. We were looking at our website traffic and it was proportional to the population size of every state. And that's sort of a wonky way of saying that, yes, the largest state referral traffic was from California, but the second largest was from Texas. And then all the way down the line in terms of the referral traffic to, the least populous state, I always forget if it's Wyoming or Rhode Island. That actually speaks to a range of audiences because political ideology is also not proportionally divided across the nation, right?
Right.
It's not a
Right.
perfect sample set across the country, and yet our sample set reflected the population of the states. So I just
Right.
think it's
If you were
interesting.
just drawing Democrats from each of these states, you would have very different numbers.
Correct, exactly. And so when we think about this, again, it bears remembering that our podcasts are things like Planet Money. They are things like Shortwave, which is our science podcast, or Life Kit. You really do have things that appeal to a broader audience. And then Up First, which is it is our most popular podcast. It's one of the top news podcasts in the country. Honestly, it's straight down the line. And I really do hear from conservatives who say, yeah, I listen to it every morning. I might be
Mm.
mad about some of the other programming, but I really listen to you. And so it's complicated because, as I said, NPR isn't even only the other public radio broadcaster. So sometimes I'll hear, I really hated that thing on X, Y, and Z. And I'm like, oh, that wasn't our show.
Yeah.
So,
Katherine, thank you so much for taking the time. I really appreciate it.
no, it was my pleasure. Thank you so much for being interested in what's happening over in our world and wanting to share some of that with your audience.
The Kicker is brought to you by the Columbia Journalism Review and produced by Amanda Dara. I'm your host, Josh Hirsch.